So next we have Dr. Cheri Blauwet, who is a mother, physician, gold-winning Paralympic athlete, and leader in the Olympic and Paralympic movement. In addition to serving as associate professor in physical medicine and rehabilitation at Harvard Medical School and an attending physician, Cheri is the director of the Kelly Adaptive Sports Research Institute at Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital and Harvard Medical School, and has more than 60 peer-reviewed journal articles posted in sports medicine, adaptive sports and exercise, and women in medicine. In 2016, she was the recipient of Howard Medical School Harold Amos Faculty Diversity Award. She is also a retired Paralympic athlete in the sport of wheelchair racing, competing for the United States team in 3 Paralympic Games, and bringing home a total of 7 Paralympic medals. She is a 2-time winner in both the Boston and New York City marathons. Some of her other accolades include being nominated for and winning many awards, as well as being inducted into the University of Arizona Adaptive Athletics Hall of Fame. I could go on listing Cheri's accolades, but I will conclude my introduction by saying that Cheri has become a global leader who leverages her personal and professional experiences to advocate for inclusion and accessibility. So please help me welcome Dr. Cheri Blauwet.
Thank you. Thanks, Katie. Good morning, everyone. It is absolutely a pleasure to be with you here today. Thank you very much for the introduction as well. Very kind, of course. So, when I think about being here with you this morning, I'm going to take some time to talk about my experiences as an adaptive athlete, as a clinician with a disability, but throughout this entire talk, I want everybody to be thinking about the role that so many disability resource professionals and other allies have had in shaping some of these experiences and providing some of these opportunities. All right, if I could advance the slides. There we go. So a brief outline for the morning. I'm going to first touch upon understanding some modern concepts of disability culture and the ADA generation. And I know that much of this is very familiar to this audience. I'm going to speak to it very briefly from the lens of being a practicing physician, a retired Paralympic athlete, and how some of these concepts have shaped my experiences over the years. I'm going to talk briefly about where we're at in terms of disability and the representation of people with disabilities in medical education and the health professions. I'll provide some supporting stories and vignettes and talk to you about my personal journey, and then finish with a call to action and how we can all be agents for change. And I realize that on some of these slides, if there's sections at the bottom of the slide that are difficult to see, because of the captioning, I'll read those out throughout the talk so that everyone can catch all of that content. I also wanted to start with a few disclaimers about who I am and what I represent and what lens I bring to this work. I am clearly a lifelong wheelchair user and a person who brings lived experience. I'm a practicing physician, researcher, and leader in healthcare. As was noted, a retired Paralympic athlete, and importantly, and where I spend most of my time these days, I'm a wife and a mother to 2 children under 5 years old. But what I am not is all-knowing about the lived experience of all types of disabilities, including the lived experience that many of you bring to your work. I'm not a disability studies scholar or a disability rights attorney, or currently a public servant in representative local, state, or federal government. And because of that, I realize that there are many of you in this audience who bring your own lens to this content with even a higher level of expertise than I could ever represent. So I want to say from the start that I approach this topic with curiosity, and I hope you do too, because I recognize that we are all learning from one another every step of the way. So first, touching upon the ADA generation, understanding disability culture and where we're at, and my lens to this. Now, everyone here is aware of the difference between the medical and the social model. I put this brief infographic here, credit to Aaron Human, but important to note that when we're talking about the health professions, the experience of people working to break into the health professions and develop careers in this space, we are talking about a sector that is really entrenched and built around that medical model. So we have to do extra work to really educate and to bring people along with us into understanding the social model of disability. And of course, this impacts me every day. Under the medical model, when people see me through that lens, which happens regularly at work as a physician, you know, I'm a 42-year-old woman, I'm a wheelchair user, I have a spinal cord injury. Because of my spinal cord injury, I have neurogenic bladder, I'm at risk for certain secondary health conditions, and I have all these compounded effects of my actual medical diagnosis, which of course can in many ways create a lot of bias from the moment that my colleagues see me wheel through the door in the morning. If, of course, we then transition to thinking about the social model, I'm a practicing physician based in Boston. I live in an accessible home. I get in my adaptive car. I drive to work and park in the parking garage and ride an elevator up to my office, and I start my work at 8 o'clock in the morning every day. And my level of function on a daily basis is very high because the world around me accommodates my needs and is fully inclusive, and I've built that world along with help from many of my peers over the years. So although all of you are familiar with this model, I wanted to touch upon it and remind us all that when we talk about working with students who have interest in the health professions, we ourselves have to continue to educate about that transition into the social model on a regular basis because people may not have that lens. And of course, it's extremely important to set the stage with definitions, where we have the ADA with its amendments in 2008. All of you are well familiar of these definitions. And then the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities from 2006, which I love this definition of disability as an evolving concept, stressing that disability results from an interaction between persons with impairments and the attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So over the years, what we've seen is this evolution from working around a policy and legal framework, which is incredibly important for protecting our basic rights and ensuring that, we are not denied opportunities on the basis of disability. But we've also seen this evolution into more of a human rights framework, which is really helpful because it brings us to the next level of understanding that we are all people moving about the world with the same rights and privileges as our peers. The World Health Organization many years ago published the ICF, or the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health, where function and therefore disability is known as this dynamic interaction between health conditions, environmental factors, and personal factors. And again, when we talk about healthcare and the health professions, our focus is here on that health condition, and we spend years learning about how to understand physiology, how to make diagnoses, and how to treat medical conditions. And we have to then go one step further and continue to remind our peers and colleagues and those working in the field that these environmental and personal factors that are at the bottom of the figure are just as important to someone's ultimate success, their participation in their community, and their ability to set their own goals and strive for those goals in life. So ultimately, we've gotten to this place where we have this entire generation of empowered young people, the ADA generation. And I love this quote from the Institutional for Educational Leadership. Rebecca Coakley, a very well-known advocate, has driven a lot of this work, where we note that the ADA generation comprises young people with disabilities who came of age under the ADA. Their lives, experiences, and aspirations are very different than those of their predecessors. And it's this ADA generation that is now entering higher education, right? And striving for careers in new spaces where, frankly, we may not have been previously welcome. And so as this spectrum develops and as we move this field forward in terms of inclusive practices in the health professions, we, for all of the right reasons, have this empowered group of young people who are knocking at the door and saying, this is what I want to be and what I want to do. And it's our job to think about how to create those opportunities and ensure success. And of course, we've now moved from embracing concepts of disability rights to going even one step further towards disability justice, where we understand that all of the intersections of these marginalized identities come together, and we are all moving forward together to open up our world to the vast opportunities that are available to all individuals, right? And this allyship is really powerful, where we see advocates from different sectors coming together to think about this justice model, and disability simply being a part of that very important conversation, which I really liked. I loved this image. I don't know if at the bottom you can see the credit to the body is not an apology.com. It's a great website. I welcome you to check it out. So now I want to talk just briefly about disability and medical education in the health professions. I realized there was an entire pre-conference on this topic for the last several days and another session following my talk this morning. So I'm sure many of you have had the chance to do a little bit of a deeper dive in this space. Much credit to my colleagues in the audience who have really been leaders in this field and are really doing the research and doing the advocacy, mobilizing the community to open up opportunities in this area. I'm going to share some of your work and hope that I give appropriate credit to it. So the fact is that people with disabilities remain dramatically underrepresented in the health professions. Frankly, it's an area, it's a career path where we are behind, and we're catching up in terms of opening up these opportunities. Although people with disabilities are about 25% of the US population, we comprise just a small proportion of medical students, and even smaller proportion of students in other allied health professions like nursing, rehabilitation sciences like physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, other areas of health services. Some basic facts and figures. 2 key areas of work. My colleague Sarah Eckmeyer published back in the day in 2012 a brief study looking at a survey of medical school deans where they asked about the nature and the frequency of students with disabilities. They only asked about mobility and sensory disability, and at that time noted that people represented about 0.56 of all students at matriculation, or 0.42 of all students at graduation, so less than 1% of students across the country. Lisa Meeks, a colleague who I believe is here this morning, so much credit to her and her incredible leadership over the last several years. Did more recent research doing a survey of medical school disability resource professionals or other people who are sort of on point for disability services at medical schools, asking about the nature and frequency of students with disabilities, cross-disability, all-inclusive. And with this type of lens, students with disabilities represented approximately 4.6 of total enrollment across all schools, with psychological and learning disability being most common. So this is a figure from one of Dr. Meeks' papers where we look at the overall prevalence of disability based by common categories. You'll see that the disability that's most represented within current medical school populations is ADHD, followed by learning disability, followed by psychological disability. Again, it's important to note that many of these are non-apparent disabilities from the standpoint of how we see people. Followed by chronic health conditions, and then mobility, visual, deaf, hard of hearing, and other functional impairments. So when we think about who are the students that we need to be considering, who's our audience for this work, it's important to understand that there are students with many different types of disabilities, many of them non-apparent, that we need to be thinking about in terms of accommodations and creating a positive disability culture. With this disability profile in mind, this paper then goes forward to talk about, well, what are some of the most common accommodations that are requested? So at the top, in terms of didactic accommodations, is testing, facilitated learning, ergonomic accommodations, and so on. And in terms of clinical accommodations, this is inclusive of also testing accommodations in terms of actual clinical practice, general clinical, and so on from there. So this is a very helpful, I would say, landmark paper that talks about who are our students, What are we doing to ensure their success, and where do we need to think about expanding into the future? So there are clearly ongoing challenges to that, what I would say, proverbial ivory tower. And I think it's important to recognize at all stages of someone's career journey, you know, what are those ongoing barriers that we need to be thinking about most concretely? For students and trainees, I think that one of the major challenges is this lack of clarity regarding what we call technical standards. Technical standards is a sort of, frankly, outdated way of thinking about the basic requirements that every student needs to meet in order to graduate, in terms of both their cognitive capacity, but also their physical capacity and ability to do hands-on tasks. Additionally, until recently, it's been very difficult to seek mentorship and find role models in this space, and that is changing, again, thanks to the work of many people in this audience. It's incredible to see. I started medical school in 2003. I was an N of 1 at my school. I think I was the first, as far as I'm aware, of being at least, of having a visible disability. And because of this, I really felt like I was, frankly, going it alone and forging my own path and learning as I went, which was a valuable experience, but I certainly didn't have that key role model or that key group of people where I could go for a question here and there, or to understand what best practices had been helpful to them. Again, a lot of that is changing. We've seen mobilization of this community, which has been absolutely fantastic. But this has really been over the last maybe 5 to 10 years, and prior to that, there was a big dearth of role modeling and mentorship opportunities, which has created a lot of gaps. At the level of faculty and professionals, it's important to note, of course, that disability status can change over the course of someone's life. And particularly for physicians who are aging, there is a lot of fear of disability disclosure due to ongoing stigma, either self-perceived or by those around them, and perceived lack of competence or even concerns about licensing. And across the profession, when we think about healthcare in general and the health professions, these characteristics of strength and endurance are still historically valued. And although we're moving beyond that to understand that our diversity is our strength in the health professions, we have a lot of baggage, frankly, that we're carrying with us from prior generations. Additionally, this outdated concept of what we call the undifferentiated student remains alive and well, meaning that for many decades, it was always understood that, well, if you start medical school on day one, you need to be undifferentiated, meaning that you needed to be able to be a pediatrician or a psychiatrist or a neurosurgeon. And that concept of the undifferentiated student has really been problematic for students with disabilities who, of course, have incredible capabilities, but may not be able to fully differentiate into certain facets of the field, right? And of course, there's no reason why someone with quadriplegia and who uses a power chair can't be an absolutely phenomenal psychiatrist or many other areas of health and health professions. But when we think about this undifferentiated lens, it creates problems for that same individual and ongoing bias and stigma that they may prevent them from initially being accepted or admitted into school in the first place. So there's been responses over the years, right? And again, I'm not myself deeply embedded in policy, so this is my lens to it. But what I've seen has been this shift of culture in terms of the community's response. The AAMC is the American Association of Medical Colleges. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. And they do a lot of work in terms of creating standards and best practices for medical education. And what we've seen is a real sea change coming from this organization, which I'm using as an example, but this is now being seen across many different peer organizations similar to the AAMC. Pre-ADA, way back in the day, in response to Section 504, there was an initial publication about from the Special Advisory Panel on Technical Standards for Medical School Admission. This is where that technical standards concept came from. In this document, they outlined these 5 key areas of necessary skill, including observation, communication, motor capability, conceptual, integrative, and quantitative, and behavioral and social. And they noted that the use of a trained intermediary means that a candidate's judgment must be mediated by someone else's power of selection and observation, and therefore at that time, that was not seen as acceptable for meeting the technical standards. Thankfully, we've seen a lot of change. Immediately after the ADA was passed, or within a few years, there was another publication which I think even the title of it basically tells you their lens, The Disabled Student in Medical School, an overview of legal requirements. This isn't about opportunity, right? It's about what do you need to do in order to avoid risk. If you then fast forward to 2010, a publication with a much different title, Medical Students with Disabilities, Resources to Enhance Accessibility. So again, what we see is this culture shift in terms of the community's response from being extremely reactive and simply thinking about this as an area of risk to being very proactive and starting to embrace the fact that, again, our diversity is our strength, and that includes students with disabilities. From one of the publications that I mentioned earlier, that's the paper by Sarah Eckmeyer, there are a few quotes that I think are really interesting. And remember, this was published in 2012, and this talks about, what are some of those ongoing areas of bias that are probably still there, even though we're now 10 years down the road. Again, there's been a lot of progress, but certainly still some concerns. And remember, these are quotes from leaders of medical schools. The theme of the undifferentiated medical student, where it's our view as an institution that students should perform all those functions that may be required to perform as an intern, irrespective of specialty, and that we have a responsibility to provide reasonable accommodations to help them do so. If they can't do it with or without accommodations, they don't graduate. So here, at least, there is a recognition of accommodations, but again, not with potentially the most proactive or open-minded point of view. The theme of hidden discrimination comes through. We've made exceptions to our technical standards, right, to allow students to graduate. Most of our students with disabilities have, despite physical limitations, been very high functioning and been able to adapt and been able to accommodate reasonably well. Having said that, one of the most difficult aspects is career counseling and residency applications for students with disabilities, which should be disclosed via ARIS application in the personal statement, MSPE letter. Some of our students with disabilities have had a difficult time matching despite being bright and highly motivated students. So, where's the gap, right? If these are bright and highly motivated students, what is the point by which we can put this student forward for residency applications or for what we call the match, but there's still this concern about things falling through the cracks and hidden discrimination that can impact these students quite substantially. And then the theme of perception of disability as a means of manipulation, which unfortunately I still think is in the heads of many people, right? The number of students announcing their disabilities after they've experienced academic difficulty presents an appearance of gaming a system in many instances. And remember, this was a quote, anonymous, but a quote from someone in a leadership position at a medical school. So again, this was published 10 years ago, but these concepts, these biases don't go away overnight. And these are some of the things that we're working through and working against, and I wanted to provide you with some of those examples. And what about practicing physicians? So there's been only one study. This was, again, led by Dr. Meeks, but first author was Nori, just published recently, where they looked at a survey of physicians. This was 6,000 physicians, asking them about the presence of disability, cross-disability, and they noted a 3.1% prevalence in that population. Most common were chronic health conditions, mobility, and psychological. Physicians with disabilities were more likely to be older, and interestingly, many with multiple marginalized identities, which again brings us back to that concept of disability justice and the fact that when we're thinking about seeing this work through a justice lens, we have to think about the intersection of these marginalized identities. And the ongoing challenges in this space, the fear of disclosure is still huge. And although, we are an enlightened audience here at AHEAD, the broader medical community, and particularly people who trained and went through medical training many decades ago, have a very intense fear of stigma if they were to self-report disability. That goes along, of course, with concern about removal from the specialty, medical licensure. And it's important to note that currently practicing physicians have even fewer supports available in comparison to students. Students at least have all of you, right, who are there to support them and to get behind them and to help them work through some of these challenges. Current practicing professionals frequently don't. And if you look at it from the lens of the hospital where they may be working or the healthcare system, There may be an ADA coordinator who's available to assist with accommodations. There may be programs like the Employee Assistance Program for one-on-one assistance or occupational health, but it's far less mobilized and organized. And I think so many physicians have difficulty in knowing where to even go if they were to need accommodations. Additionally, we see all the time that when we think about diversity initiatives for faculty and staff, that disability is very frequently neglected and left out. There's so much work going on in terms of embracing diversity, the development of ERGs, so much great work to enable people to embrace their full identity and bring that forward and celebrate that. But disability is still far too frequently an afterthought, and those of us working in this space need to call that out and be able to say that it needs to be included alongside all of these parallel efforts. Of course, there are many other examples, and I didn't want to neglect the fact that there are many other professional organizations who are working on these topics at varied places along that spectrum towards development of full programs. The National Organization of Nurses with Disabilities is great. I would say nursing as a field still has a lot more work to do. And when we think about some of those best practice guidelines, the mobilization of the community, I think we're a bit further along in medicine, but we're seeing some change in the nursing field, which is fantastic. And of course, there's some really wonderful leaders out there who are leading that work. The American Occupational Therapy Association, American Physical Therapy Association, I wanted to call out as certainly having some focus on disability given the nature of their work, and also the fact that that ADA generation certainly also has interest in other aspects of rehabilitation. These are just a few examples. There are many others, but certainly wanted to note that this is not a medicine-only discussion, although I'm using that as the primary exemplar for today. So now I wanted to tell you a little bit about my own journey through higher education, and how that certainly provides a lens towards the critically important role that all of you play in supporting students, and how we can think about the future and moving forward to continue to expand opportunities. So, as was noted in the introduction, I currently am based in Boston, where I practice. My clinical practice is focused on sports medicine. I do research in adaptive and Paralympic sport, and I serve as the chief medical officer at Spalding. But I'm actually a Midwest farm kid. I was born and raised on a small family farm in northwest Iowa, way up in the corner, where I've put the pin on that map. I was born with no disability, but was involved in a farming accident at 16 months of age. I was actually run over by a tractor, one of those lucky to be alive moments. And because of that, I sustained a T10 spinal cord injury, and have been, of course, a person with a disability, and initially a scooter and now wheelchair user since that time. So this picture on the top left is a picture of me with two of my cousins and the farm cat. You can see some hay bales in the background. And my injury occurred in 1981, so this was far before the ADA. Obviously, we lived in a fairly rural part of the country, and there was very little discussion and very little knowledge and understanding about the broader disability rights movement within my community. That said, being from a small town, everybody knows everybody, and people support each other. And that, I think, was a really critically important part of my early childhood experience. That scooter that I'm using in the image was made by one of our neighbors so that I could get around the farm and get dirty and get into trouble, just like all my cousins. And having those opportunities, was really important. That said, when I think about my self-identity and my self-concept now as an adult, I recognize that the person most critical in shaping that self-identity at a very young age was my mother. And this is a picture of her. Her name is Cheri Blauwet. And she was a fierce advocate mom. And thank goodness she was, because she was the one who was out there in the community and in my school and in my preschool telling people that they cannot and should not lower their expectations of me. And she was pretty fierce about it. We were just having a coffee a couple of years ago, now as adults. And at one point she asked me, Cheri, when you were a kid, did you think I was mean to you? I was like, no, I don't remember you ever being mean to me. And she said, because sometimes other people in the community would say that I was being too mean to you, right? Because she had expectations, right? I had to pick up my own stuff. I had to study. I had to do all of the things that are expected of a young person who you're trying to raise into a highly functioning adult. But at that time, that was perceived as being too harsh, right? And the reason for that is because societal expectations were still so low. And the default understanding was that acquiring a disability at a young age was something that set your life on a trajectory of those low expectations or of lack of achievement. And so, of course, as I grew up a bit, I started school. And in our rural farming community, I went to a small public school. It's pictured here. It was West Lyon Community High School, which was the whole western part of the county that I lived in. It was K through 12, all under one roof. So the reputation that you had in kindergarten was the reputation that you had when you graduated high school. Very hard to change that. And as I entered school and started to go through kindergarten and early elementary school, I did start to get involved in certain activities, and these were the things that you would expect, frankly, things that were fairly sedentary. And I always remember people in that time frame when they would say, well, Cheri, what do you want to be when you grow up? You know, I actually really liked outer space, so I'd often say, oh, I want to be an astronomer or, something to that effect. And I remember that people would often reply with a phrase that was something to the effect of, well, you should do something you can be good at, which was really a way of saying, do something that aligns with those somewhat lowered expectations of you. And certainly, I don't think that anyone in that time would have been thinking, well, Cheri, what about healthcare? Or what about being a physician? Or what about being a professional Paralympic athlete, right? And there were some key moments subsequent to that that really started to change that perception, both of myself and of the others that were working around me. One of them was that in 8th grade, our high school track coach, who was also the football coach and the English teacher and PE teacher, he went to the Iowa Girls High School State Track Championships in Des Moines, Iowa. And when he was there, he saw a wheelchair racing exhibition event that was taking place on the program. There was a 100-meter and a 400-meter event, as well as shot put. And he came back to school, and he tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, Cheri, I just saw this sport called wheelchair racing. I think you should try it. Come out for the team. And I looked at him, and I very keenly remember my first reaction being, thanks, coach, but I don't play sports, right? I'm not an athlete, which was really, to my 8th grade mind, a self-protective mechanism, or really, I think an element of self-defense, because I had never been given those opportunities. Of course, I had no idea if I was interested in sports. I had self-selected out of them, or not even given it consideration, because there were no opportunities, right? And I had never seen a person with a spinal cord injury compete in high-level sports. So why in the world would I consider myself an athlete? So I totally turned him down. I was like, no thanks. Luckily, this coach, who is just an incredible person, was very persistent. And he kept seeing me in school, in the cafeteria, in the hallway, what have you. And every time he saw me, he'd look at me, he'd say, coming out for the team, right? And I said, nope, not for me, thanks, I'm good. Little did I know that he had double teamed, and he had talked to my parents. So then I'd go home, and we'd be at the kitchen table, and they'd be like, Cheri, you're going out for the track team, right? And I'd be like, no thanks, Mom, I'm good. But with all of that, of course, positive pressure, in the best of ways, when they called or they announced the start of track season the following year, I decided to show up. I showed up for practice, I got a jersey, and I started pushing laps around the track in my everyday chair like this, although it was at that time much bigger and clunkier, while all of my classmates ran laps around me. The coach was very kind and would give me specific workouts so that there was an inclusive mindset around it. We would go to track meets in the Northwest Iowa region. All of those, everyone had worked together, so at that track meets they had some wheelchair racing events on the program. Now, of course, I was typically the only athlete competing in these events, so I was racing the clock rather than other competitors. And frankly, it was not a fulfilling experience, because imagine any 9th grader that you know running a 100-meter dash by themselves in front of an audience, right? It's not your idea of fun as a teenager. And so by the end of that track season, I was pretty much ready to throw in the towel. I'd said, I'd given it a try. I had appeased this coach. I had appeased my parents. I'm all set. And I had another pivotal moment when we went to that state track meet in Des Moines at the end of the season. And I wheeled out onto the track, and I ran into 3 or 4 other adolescent girls who were there to compete from other schools across the state. They had racing wheelchairs, which was fascinating to me. And honestly, they were really cool, right? And more than anything, I was immediately intrigued because I wanted to be their friend and I wanted to be part of their social circle. So I got to chatting with them. I learned that there were wheelchair racing and adaptive sport practices that happened in Des Moines every weekend. And I was immediately hooked because I wanted to be part of that social community. And when I think back, it's because, I can easily understand that that's because I had really felt isolated in my own school environment. And so to suddenly have the opportunity to interact regularly with other students with disabilities where we could chat with one another, crack wheelchair jokes, have that sort of inside humor was really an important opportunity for me, and I was totally hooked. It was only after several years of going to those practices and acquiring a racing wheelchair and doing the training that I actually started to get good at the sport and acquire interest in the sport itself. So it was a social hook that then led to the athletic career, which I think is a really important point. Along that same time frame, I had some inaugural experiences with the world of disability resource professionals. And interestingly, by that time I knew that I was interested in the sciences and STEM and sort of technology. And I frankly don't remember where I found the information, but I came upon this program at the University of Washington, which still exists today, led by Cheryl Bergstaller, called the Do It program. And applied, was accepted, and went out for 2 weeks to Seattle in the summer between my sophomore and junior years of high school to be a part of this program. And here I am in the top front row. And this was really also very life-changing and very self-perception changing from the standpoint of my academic abilities. And wanted to point out that so much of this was because of this intersection and because of the work that you do that at a very early point in time was starting to change my mindset around my own potential and my own career goals, through training. So ultimately, as I graduated high school and thought about higher education, I knew a couple of things. I knew that I was probably interested in a career in the life sciences, maybe med school, but I wasn't sure. And I knew I wanted to continue to play sports. So I started to look around for universities, colleges and universities around the country where I could blend those two interests. And at the time, there were 2 universities that had well-developed wheelchair racing programs. One of them was the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and one was the University of Arizona in Tucson. And I know there are many colleagues, probably from both of those institutions here with us today. And ultimately, when I thought about, where was the best package of opportunities for me, I decided to leave the Midwest and to go down to Tucson for college. So I entered and matriculated at the University of Arizona in the fall of 1998. At that time, the adaptive athletics program was in a very rapid phase of development. It was really exciting to be a part of that journey. The program there is just really exceptional and very special for numerous reasons. I want to give credit to Sue Kroger, Dr. Sue Kroger, who led the Disability Resource Center there for many years, and now, of course, to Amanda, who continues to lead the charge and continue to innovate and build more programs. And what I think was so special about my experience at the U of A was that the opportunities, the inclusive opportunities there, inclusive of academic support as well as adaptive athletics, enabled me to embrace my full self, right? And to realize my potential across different areas. And ultimately, because these were 2 aspects that were such a strong part of my identity, being able to pursue both of those areas was incredibly important to me. And I think if I had had one without the other, it would have been a very different experience. And I bring that forth because I think it's so important to think about, how do we empower people academically, but what are the other aspects of student life and that student experience that we know are available broadly that we need to open up in order to create that full concept of inclusion. For me, sports was an absolutely critical part of that, but for other students, it will be other thematic areas where they may have a niche interest and want to build their career. And having that comprehensive approach to me was really critical. The other thing I remember when I landed in Tucson at the University of Arizona was I immediately remember how striking it was that I would roll around campus and I would see other people with disabilities regularly. And to me, this was new. The visibility of the disability community there was something that I had never personally encountered before. And the visibility of that community, both in terms of seeing other students with visible disabilities, but also the community that brought through sports, through various activities and networking, really brought me to a whole nother level of confidence and of positive self-identity and embracing my disability as something that brought strength, right? And as a very proud part of my identity. Whereas prior to landing at the U of A, that certainly was not the case. And ultimately, the opportunities there have led to success in many different areas for which I'm so thankful and have so much gratitude. On the field of play in the sports sector, I qualified for my first Paralympic Games when I was a student at the U of A. This was Sydney in 2000. That really launched my international career, and I ended up having the opportunity to compete for Team USA at 2 more Paralympics. The middle picture is Athens 2004, where I brought home my gold in the 800 meters. And on the right is Beijing 2008. And this journey through sports and having the opportunity to have this launched at the U of A was really, my first career and such an incredible part of my professional journey through higher education. And probably wouldn't have happened without a little bit of risk-taking behavior from that coach in high school, along with the comprehensive support that I received at the University of Arizona through the Disability Resource Center and those very broad-based programs. Ultimately, through my athletic career, I started on the track and evolved into being primarily a road racer. And my proudest achievement in sport was probably, I have many, but I'd say if you had to pin me down to one, I would say it was winning the Boston Marathon in 2004 and 2005. This is a picture of crossing the finish line in 2005. And bringing home a win in the wheelchair division of Boston was really the thing that catapulted my athletic career into a totally new space of being recognized internationally, being able to receive support from sponsors and actually make a living playing sports for a period of time. And of course was just an incredible journey. Part of that journey was also having the opportunity to meet athletes from all over the world and to hear their stories and to understand what were their barriers, challenges, and opportunities to developing an athletic career under a totally different cultural context and with a different set of resources. And that global view definitely shifted, again, my perception of disability and my own self-perception, and I owe that global view really to my sports career. This is a picture of just that last moment, bringing home the laurel wreath and the Champions Trophy, which was, of course, an absolute marquee moment in my life for which I am so proud. Ultimately, I of course, advanced my athletic career, but through that time, I never stopped going to school. And so I graduated from the University of Arizona. Through that time, decided that I did want to apply to medical school, went through that process, applied broadly, and frankly, wanted to go to the best school that I got into where I could continue to train because I wasn't yet fully retired from competing. And so I focused primarily in warm weather environments, particularly the West Coast and the Southwest, and had the incredible opportunity to be admitted to Stanford Medical School, of course, which was something that I would have never dreamed possible. But interestingly, when I landed at Stanford, I was faced with both a new set of challenges and opportunities because at the time, Stanford had a much less developed disability services infrastructure. And I was, going it alone yet again, but in a different way, right? I was the first student with a visible disability to go to Stanford, as far as I'm aware. Of course, over the years, I'm sure there were many that had gone through training there with non-apparent disabilities. But being a first is always an interesting journey, right? And when I think back about this journey, the colleagues and peers and leadership at Stanford were incredibly receptive. We did it together and we worked through it together. I think, created a lot of good foundations for growth into the future. We actually, while I was a student there, rewrote the technical standards, and I think they've been rewritten now several times since. And you know, I of course, you know, very much embraced this opportunity, but it was a different lens and sort of a different mindset than what I'd experienced at Arizona, where the infrastructure was far deeper and the approach was far more proactive. As a medical student, I was able to go through training. I received several accommodations along the way. The key one that I worked with the school to receive was a standing frame chair that I used in the operating room, and also on several other clinical rotations, to include the pediatric ICU and the neonatal ICU, where the incubators, or in order to see the babies, you have to be at quite a tall height. In the OR, using my standing frame enabled me to be right there and to see the surgery that was happening, in addition to assisting at a typical medical school level, which is usually like holding a retractor. But it allowed me to be a part of that full experience. I also did apply for and receive accommodations for one step of the testing pathway that involved the clinical skills portion, where you're actually doing a hands-on physical exam of a patient. And that was, of course, also very helpful. So through this time, obviously, my identity was again shifting from being an athlete to then, taking on the identity of being a clinician and a practicing physician. When I completed medical school, I was also winding down on my athletic career. So I was reaching this sort of pivotal moment in my life where I knew that I needed to take the next step of my medical training, but I also didn't have to be in a warm weather environment or somewhere where I could train. By that time, I had been competing internationally for about 10 years, and I felt emotionally ready to retire from high-level sport. And so I opened up my mind and I thought broadly about where I wanted to do my residency training. And as many students at Stanford do, I targeted the East Coast and the Harvard system for my residency training, and was fortunate to match to an internship program at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, and then a residency program in physical medicine and rehabilitation at Spalding, where I still now work. And making this jump from the West Coast to the East Coast and from medical school into advanced training in medicine was yet another big transition, right? Because again, the mindset shifted. Again, I was yet a first in my internship, and we were sort of restarting that learning process, but with a different lens. As an intern, I did again use a few accommodations. We made some infrastructure changes to the call room, for example, so that when I had to stay overnight, I had an accessible room where I could use the bathroom and catch some Z's, which is usually about 5 minutes worth of sleep on a call night. And the other key accommodation we made was that the interns are typically those who are very involved in code blues, and particularly the hands-on aspects of code blues, doing things like chest compressions and really getting sort of on top of a patient and pushing down very hard. And that, of course, is very difficult for me to do, especially for a patient that's in a hospital bed. Frankly, I can't do that effectively. So I worked with the residency program director, and we created a system where anytime I was on the call team, we had one extra pager that would be held by my co-intern, because there's always two interns on any call team. And we would both go to the code blues. I would be involved in some of the tasks that involved more manual dexterity, like getting what we call an ABG, or an arterial blood gas, which is an arterial stick in the wrist. I got very good at those because that was usually my job in codes. In addition to making phone calls, doing documentation, some of the more very important intellectual aspects of running a code blue. And frankly, it worked just fine. It worked out great. My co-interns were fantastic. We were all going to these events anyway, so all it did was just shift the roles of who does what. And with a little bit of open-mindedness and proactive discussion, we created a plan that served the needs of the patient, of course, which is the most important, but also enabled me to learn and enabled the whole team to move forward safely in those emergent situations. Now, through my course of medical training, of course, I've learned some lessons. And one of them is that when we think about this concept of the undifferentiated medical student, it's really, we're making a lot of false assumptions, because we need to trust that our students who have interest in medicine or other aspects of the health professions are smart, capable people who are going to be thinking about what are the accommodations that will help them to be successful. So ultimately, although I used a standing frame in medical school, that standing frame is now sitting in a closet collecting dust because I don't use it anymore. Because I've determined that in my current clinical practice, frankly, I don't need it, right? The accommodations that I use now are very straightforward. I use an exam table like the one on the top left, which is a high-low table that goes down to a level of 18 inches and can go up very high. And that's very helpful to me because my clinical practice is now primarily focused on musculoskeletal medicine, where I need to be able to examine people's shoulders and hips and knees, and also do things like injections. So by being able to move the patient up and down, I can bring them to me in a way that enables me to complete those tasks very effectively. I also, on the top right, put a picture of our Brigham and Women's Clinic in Foxboro, which is a newer clinic that was built alongside the Patriots Stadium. And this is a fantastic place to work because it is new infrastructure. And I put that there just to say that the reality is that a lot of our healthcare infrastructure around the US is old, right? And a lot of our environments are simply difficult to work in because they're small, they may be retrofitted, the accessible bathroom may be a 10-minute walk or wheel down the hallway. And so being in a place with new infrastructure, frankly, just makes my life easier on a day-to-day basis in every way. I could park underground, ride the elevator up. In the middle of clinic, the accessible bathroom is literally right around the corner because they're all accessible, all the doorways are wide, the exam rooms have enough room to maneuver. And that's very different than if I were practicing at the main campus of Brigham and Women's, where a lot of the musculoskeletal and orthopedic clinics are, in some basement that was built with a clinic that was built in 1970, and you get my point. So for me, the two key accommodations from my career as a physician are having a high-low table and frankly being in an environment with newer infrastructure, just for my personal needs. That's it, right? And so we think about all these barriers that we frequently artificially create towards students. And we think about having fear about all these complex accommodations that people may need. And certainly in some cases that may be the case, but in many cases it's simply not. And if we approach it as a discussion with the student or the early career professional and have that frank discussion about what do you need, what's practical to be helpful, we can find a solution that enables people to thrive in their clinical practices. And so many peers that I talk to that are currently practicing physicians, they'll tell you the same story. They'll tell you that the barrier to entry was at the application process and at the match where you go from medical school into your advanced training, where there are all these questions and concerns about bias and discrimination. Once you get there, you figure it out, right? And you figure it out in a way that enables you to be successful. And yes, sometimes more intensive accommodations are needed, and that's absolutely reasonable, but it's not always the case, and we need to think about how to individualize this for each person. Also wanted to touch upon lessons that I've learned about sport inclusion models, given my first career as an athlete and the way in which that was launched in that collegiate environment. This whole sector is really growing quite rapidly. I've had conversations already with some of you today about your adaptive sports programs at your universities or your interest in starting one, which is absolutely fantastic. And what we've seen is an evolution towards being somewhat rigid about these models as they develop to being fairly open-minded. There's now a group of folks that are leading this work, and they've coined these 4 key models where we can think about inclusion at the collegiate or university level. Inclusion of athletes without sport-specific accommodations. So for example, I put here a picture of Marla Runyon, who's a legally blind runner who ran in both the Olympic and Paralympic Games. Marla doesn't use accommodations. She simply competes against her peers, and that's what works for her. So in some cases, athletes can be seamlessly integrated without needing accommodation. Another model is inclusion of athletes with reasonable sport-specific accommodations. So an example is, for example, a deaf or visually impaired swimmer. For deaf swimmers, they frequently use a light that flashes when the start bell goes off so that they can obviously know when the race starts. For blind or low vision swimmers, they often use a tapper, someone who basically gives them a little tap on the head as they're approaching the wall so that they know how many more strokes to expect before they touch the wall and then do their flip turn. So simple sport-specific accommodations can make people successful. Inclusion of athletes with Paralympic eligible disabilities into specific adaptive events in individual sports. The best example of this would be someone like Tatiana McFadden, who's a dear friend and colleague. Picture on the bottom left. She obviously is a high-level elite Paralympic athlete, but she can also be integrated quite seamlessly into the track team at her university, if she so chooses, right? So these athletes tend to have disabilities that would qualify them to compete sort of in that Paralympic sphere and be part of that competition and training circuit. But it's also quite easy to integrate them at the collegiate or university level, particularly in individual sports. And then the fourth model applies primarily to team sports, where it can get a little trickier because you need a critical mass of people in order to fill that team. So the model that's really being supported is the inclusion of athletes with and without disabilities through the creation of adaptive sports teams. So great examples of this are wheelchair basketball or sled hockey, where you can actually have an integrated team of people, athletes with disabilities and able-bodied athletes that can come together to fill a team and create exciting tournament play. Then if those adaptive athletes acquire skill and talent and they want to take it to the next level, when they then go to compete at more of that Paralympic level, then logically the rules change so that it's a team only of athletes with disabilities. But by making it a mixed team at the collegiate or university level, you foster a lot more opportunity, you raise a lot more awareness, and you really bring a totally new lens towards inclusion to that sport, which is really neat to see. So these are four models that are already happening across the country, and I wanted to share them just because sports is generally not a one-size-fits-all approach, and we need to have an open mindset to think about how we grow opportunities that work for each college and university, that fit within the resources and the infrastructure of that location. Many of these programs are sitting in different places at the university. Some are within disability student services, some are within the club or intramural sports program, and at a few universities, some of these sports are integrated into the actual varsity sports infrastructure, which is really exciting to see. So again, it's all on that spectrum of development, but the key point here is that there are many different models that can work, and simply getting something launched is better than waiting for that perfect moment or that perfect program. Additionally, student athletes will have different preferences, and being able to think about how they can best be integrated to meet their preferences is really important. Wanted to also share that there is exciting work going on being driven by multiple organizations across the U.S. I'm primarily involved as a board member of the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, and we've done a lot of work to create bridges between the National Collegiate Athletic Association and the USOPC, but that work has been inclusive of both Olympic and Paralympic sport. So we're pushing, right? And we're pushing for the NCAA to think more broadly about inclusive principles. Of course, we're all waiting for that Title IX-like legislation to pass that would require opening up opportunities for students with disabilities to be part of that varsity sport infrastructure. But we can always lean on the Department of Ed and a Dear Colleague letter from 2013 that said that, hey, particularly in publicly funded universities, sport should be a part of inclusive education, and it's your responsibility to ensure that students are not discriminated against on the basis of their disability, not only in academics, but also in sports and physical activity. Now, I share with you my story and wanted to really give it that lens of thinking about all the key people along the way that created those pivotal moments, but also wanted to talk about how my story could have been different, right? And the barriers that so many students are still facing. I think that had I had a different disability, it could have been harder to accommodate, either in sports or in my career. I was pretty proactive and outspoken, but not everyone is, right? And particularly challenging is when individuals acquire new disabilities during medical training, where people are learning how to live again, in addition to trying to keep up with their training requirements. And ultimately, I think about it this way. Do I have physical limitations and a physical disability? Yes. Can I do my job and do it well? Yes. Is it okay to be a pioneer? Yes. But should all people with disabilities have to be? No, right? And I think that's what our work is all about, is creating the foundational programs so that any student, whether they're shy and introverted or loud and outspoken like me, can get the services that they need in order to be successful and to set those goals high and work towards those goals. And wanted to end with a brief call to action. And I think I see this through several key steps. The first is redefining diversity to be inclusive of disability in all cases. And this is preaching to the choir for you all, but we all need to continue to work together to bring this message forward, particularly in the health professions, because it is not the case in many instances. Encouraging disclosure and open conversation minimizes fear and stigma. We need to keep bringing it out of the closet, so to speak. Incorporating principles of universal design that strive to empower the individual and their community, and embracing our role in higher education through health professions training, empowering the whole student, and creating that legacy for the future. So ending with just a few key points. When you're out there and you're advocating for a student working to build a career in the health professions, and you may be receiving pushback, which I'm sure you do, here are some points that might help. Diversity in the health profession makes us all better providers, and it provides better patient care. And there's literature to support that. Having people with diverse backgrounds in the professions reduces implicit bias towards patients, it improves patient experience, and it empowers our leaders for the future. I have here a picture of an accessible exam table that is in a recent publication led by Lisa Iazzoni that is supported by the U.S. Access Board, talking about accessible adaptive equipment in healthcare environments. And I put this here because I say when we think about this accessible exam table, it's for patients, but it's also for clinicians and people with disabilities working in that environment, where it enables them to lower the patient, to provide a more safe transfer. And when we're all in this together as faculty and staff and working professionals alongside patients, of course, it makes us all better. We have to encourage disclosure and open conversation. Stigma around disability can still be high, and of course the first step to address it and talk about it. I wanted to share with you this op-ed that I had the opportunity to publish in the New York Times a couple of years ago that ran through just some examples of the patient interactions that I've had over the years and how we should think about moving forward. And this received really welcomed reviews, also some interesting pushback if you looked at the comments from the public when it was published. But the last paragraph, which I know might be cut off, so I'll read it to you, says, people with disabilities often express fear or dissatisfaction with our healthcare system because they face poor access and discriminatory attitudes, and this must change. Perhaps having more doctors with disabilities is one solution. As with any underrepresented group in medicine, professional diversity should reflect our population's diversity. That simple change can bring awareness, empathy, and a shared experience that ultimately makes all of us better. And ultimately that, I think, is what we're seeking. Universal design is critically important. It's, again, important to remember that many of our historic healthcare institutions, I have here a couple of pictures of MGH, for example, we're not built with this lens, right? And so when we think about designing our healthcare environments for patients and professionals together, it's a far more inclusive way to think about providing the most high quality patient care and empowering people to enter the health professions. Here are some examples. A sit-stand workstation, makes things better for everyone, whether you have a disability or not. Waveable sink operators in the bathrooms, better for patients, better for hand hygiene, better for professionals as well. Automatic door openers, closed captioning or live transcription. All of these things, when applied to our healthcare environment, are better for our patients, but also better for clinicians with disabilities themselves. We all move forward together with an inclusive mindset. And ultimately, I want to end with reminding everyone of the critical role that you play, to give you some kudos and hopefully to inspire you to keep up that hard work, which I know is often in the trenches and can often be difficult. But disability resource professionals and allies helped me to redefine my self-identity and with it, my potential. Absolutely true statement. They helped to educate me about disability culture, particularly at the U of A, where I entered very green in that respect and learned a lot along the way through my undergraduate education. They helped me understand and advocate for my rights in a really important way. They helped me find my tribe in a complex and chaotic university environment. And I can't understate or overstate the importance of this. Having my group of peer athletes, other opportunities to network with students with disabilities at my large public university of 30, 40,000 students was critically important for me to find my people and feel comfortable in that environment and move forward with confidence. And ultimately, they set my life on a trajectory of success. When I think back about going to the Do It program at the University of Washington, which is led by a disability resource professional and an academic, that shifted my mindset towards thinking about a career in medicine. All of these voices along the way had such a critically important role to play. And I just want to remind everyone of that role that you play in students' lives. And I want to end on the simple point that you can and already are doing the same for so many students. So thank you for everything that you do. And I hope that being here at this conference with colleagues and having the opportunity to be together again for learning and collegiality and networking is helpful to sort of reinvigorate some of that enthusiasm. So with that, I will finish. I wanted to, of course, give credit to my husband and 2 kids, there they are, who support me in so many ways. If anyone's interested in reaching out, my social media handle is noted here. Always happy to interact and answer additional questions. And I think if we have time, we can do a little bit of Q&A now as well. So thank you. There's these really bright lights facing the stage, so I don't know if that I'll see you. Okay, I see a hand here.
Wait till I get there with the mic.
Oh, I think someone's coming with a mic.
Good morning, thank you.
Good morning.
I am curious to hear more about how you worked with the Stanford Medical School to update the technical standards and what process you used to engage the administration in that process.
Thank you. So, so frankly, this was now like 15 years ago, so my memories are a little faded, but at the time I answered, so when I started, Stanford actually already had fairly, the technical standards were not the most rigid, right? They were already fairly progressive from the standpoint of being a little bit more, providing more so of a framework rather than like hard obligations. So that was helpful. So we were starting from a fairly good point. If I recall, I think that at that time they approached me because they were seeing what was happening in terms of this context across the country, and they wanted to get student input. At that time also involved, I think he's not here anymore, but Dr. Pete Poulos, who I know was part of the pre-conference, engaged in that discussion as well, and has now, he's still at Stanford, and I know has continued to work with the medical school administration to continue to provide those updates. So frankly, I don't recall the specifics of what word we inserted or didn't insert, but what I recall about the process was that what was helpful was that there was a recognition that they needed to be reviewed and potentially updated, and they were very proactive about getting student input to that, and particularly engaging students with lived experience, which was extremely helpful and, of course, the right thing to do. You know, in my experience at Stanford, that was my primary observation there, was that although the disability culture on campus honestly wasn't very strong, and again, that's changed. At the time, it was not very strong. The open-mindedness towards feedback and to growing together was very, very high. And I think that made all the difference. So to students who are thinking about graduate school or health professions education in a place where they may be a first, right? Or they may be forging that path, I think a key thing to look for is a school that is approaching it with that mindset, because if they're approaching it with a mindset of this being a discussion and engaging students along the way, rather than a unidirectional conversation from administration down to the students, that is gonna go better, and it's gonna empower the student in a totally different way.
Hey there. Oh, this is super loud. I'm right in front of you, so right here behind the camera guy.
Oh, hi.
There we go. Hi. Carolyn Phillips from Georgia
Carolyn.
Tech. I've been a big fan of yours. Actually, watched you win in person the Boston Marathon.
Oh,
so
thank you.
yes, it was great to hear you and continued success. It's exciting. Two big questions that I have. One, I'm super concerned about health equity when it comes to, especially making things much more accessible. How many people with disabilities died because of COVID, because of a lack of information in a timely way? And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that, how to really push the community,
Yeah.
public health, everybody forward.
Yeah.
And especially on campuses too, with accommodations and all of that. The other piece that, and this is just another aside, is how inaccessible medical equipment is
Yeah.
for people with disabilities, mammograms, all of that. I'm super concerned about those things. So
Yeah.
could you speak to either one or both?
Sure. Thank you for the questions, and thanks for being there at the finish. Health equity, of course, it's a huge concern, and I think that frankly, I would say a couple of things. I'd say that I think that the COVID pandemic, although it was tragic in the way it disproportionately impacted people with disabilities, I do think it raised the visibility of disability and health equity concerns in healthcare in a really important way. I saw that in our healthcare system, which is the largest in Massachusetts, where prior to the pandemic, certainly there was a lot of work and efforts around health equity broadly. We had to, we were already working hard to integrate disability into that work, but we weren't getting very far. And once the pandemic hit, and then, once the visibility of the disparities around the disability community were noted, it's made the conversation easier and helped us to advance that work more quickly. I'd say a couple of things. I think that, one big gap that exists across the country within certainly our public health infrastructure, but also something like the pandemic response, is that we don't collect data about disabilities systemically. And so I think, if we were to think about what's the one thing from a health equity standpoint that would really start to move the needle, I could list 50 things, but data collection and starting to do that more systematically would be probably at the top of my list, because as you know, that age-old quote, if you're not counted, you don't count, right? And so the problems and the disparities are invisible until we start to measure them and know where we're starting, and then develop programs and services to make it better. In the short term, I'd say that for those working in large healthcare systems, we just got to keep pushing for all of the work that's being done around health equity more broadly to be inclusive of disability. I know that at Mass General Brigham, our huge system, we have this huge campaign called United Against Racism, which is phenomenal. And a lot of resources going towards it in terms of both human resources, leadership, staff, program services, a broad expansion of our medical interpreter services, for example, a broad expansion of patient data collection so that we know the demographic background of our patients and the preferred language of our patients. But again, we're there saying, hey, as we develop this work, let's bring disability along because of those important intersections and because of that disability justice framework where we know that people of color also have disabilities. So let's build programs that serve people who have those intersectional identities. And it's still, it's still hard. It's still often not heard. So, I'd say systemically, public health-wise, data collection would be probably, I think, the #1 goal. And in the short term, as we're developing programs and services to be advocates for disability, to be brought along with that. Thank you.